This next episode is with Dr. Kristina Baines, Associate Professor of Anthropology at City University of New York at Guttman Community College. She's also an affiliated faculty at CUNY's Graduate School of Public Health. In this conversation, we discuss her anthropological perspective, including a framework that she's developed in her career called Embodied Ecological Heritage, which links everyday health with the heritage practices that take place in specific ecologies. We also discussed the several collaborative projects that she has going on over at Cool Anthropology, a website that she co-founded with her wife, Victoria Costa. This website hosts a series of collaborative projects, and we touch on a couple of them, including their Shifting Stereotypes project, which is an interactive documentary that is set to release soon. We also talk about the Ethnography Matters project, which can be thought of as a collaborative discussion about the use of ethnographic methods for all purposes for people everywhere. The conversation starts with discussing how she applies an anthropological definition of health, especially right now during COVID-19. So you really got impacted by COVID then, because, I think here we were winding down for another couple months, but it sounds like you had probably 3 months or so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been about 3 months, sort of mid. It was it's the second week of classes that mid-March that we went to remote to distance learning.
Right.
And I think the restaurants closed mid-March. And now they're just now opening up outdoor service. So it's been a long time to be indoors in an apartment.
Yeah, so. I get that. And I think that's the other thing that's interesting for right now. I think I read an article talking about quarantine fatigue. Everyone's just really done with it in a lot of ways, and we still have these big gatherings happening every so often. And as a medical anthropologist, what do you how do you see sort of how you've attended to those kind of health issues throughout this semester? Because at this point, everyone's feeling all types of things, aside from COVID. I read your sort of piece about health, how it's a little more holistic than just bodily health. And as a professor, how do you think you've been able to apply that for your students and for your faculty position right now?
Right. Yeah, no, it's really apparent, right? Because, an infectious disease, right? A virus, COVID, has everybody thinking immediately about physical safety and prioritizing everybody's sort of, the infection and the lack of infection or protecting from infection as being the number one priority. But I've certainly seen what happens, and I think we're seeing it more and more, right? My students right now, we're looking at defining health, and I feel like mental health. So I try to break down, the mental and the physical health. But when we're talking about infectious disease, they talk about mental health or emotional health as being, as something that we hadn't thought about when we did this, right? When we went into quarantine, nobody was thinking about how it would affect our mental health. And I think there's an acceptance that people would have to, that we're doing it for a reason, right? That this infection is real. And I think there's an acceptance of that, but supporting students in that way to kind of think about health holistically, I think has enabled them, not enabled, but encouraged them to say, okay, well, maybe I can feel bad even if I didn't lose someone, even if I didn't get infected, even if my family members weren't infected, even if it was just the isolation or just the fear or just the, the hearing about others, and then there's so many other, I don't know, aspects to, coming into the campus, in New York. We were talking about it a little earlier about how New York is such the community, or being going through something together kind of in a physical
Mm.
space is a very intense experience in New York. It's like a very embodied experience, right? Of
Mm.
being on the subway, of like coming into a classroom. And for students, that's really, really important, right? So it's just a very important thing to be able to kind of leave their neighborhood and travel to
Mm.
another neighborhood and to get into the college space. And I think that we're definitely seeing the impacts, you know.
Mm.
And you know, there's a few things to, you know, to support students. We talk about trauma and how to support students through trauma, especially in the online space. You know, it's difficult, like creating a sense of community or replicating that sense of community and belonging in the online space is a difficult thing to do. But my students are participating in the project out of the University of Connecticut, the Pandemic Journaling Project. You may have heard of it,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
they they have to read the public boards and comment on them. And it was a very interesting. A lot of students this week. There was a public post about hugging,
Mm.
and one of the students shared about how a lot of students were like, "Oh yes, I really miss hugging. I really miss hugging. You know, like hugging is so
Mm.
important." And hugging, you know, reduces stress, which we know impacts our bodies in such a harmful way, you know. And hugging, you know, maintains that connection. We're social animals. And so they kind of like talked a lot about hugging. And a student shared an experience about how her uncle had passed away and they had a small funeral for him, and she wanted to hug her aunt.
Mm.
And then she did, and then she felt guilty that
Ah.
she hugged her aunt. Like,
Wow.
wow, like there's so many, like we could talk about that for 2 hours, right? About like feeling guilt for craving touch and giving in to doing something that, you know, you're not supposed to do, that you've been told not to by, you know,
Mm.
the directives of the state or the,
Yeah.
however you want to.
That's
So,
yeah.
so how do I handle that? I mean, I feel like I just say that this is true, right? What you're feeling, missing hugging and feeling sick about it, like feeling that you don't feel well because you can't hug,
Mm.
there's science behind that too. The only science is not, you know, you inhale a droplet or a particle, that there's way more
Yeah.
to the actual, the reality, right? This empirical reality. So honoring those
Mm.
experiences as not something that are just in your head. You know, we fight against that as medical anthropologists, this
Mm.
idea that something is just in your head. You know, we know that that's not separate or
No,
different, that those
definitely
chemicals
not. Yeah.
are part of what makes us healthy. And I think that, you know, for young students that are just starting out at college and that are kind of in the midst of this trauma, um, just knowing that that's real in whatever way we
Mm.
define real, right? You know, not to get too far into this idea of, you know, science and empiricism and what that actually means. But,
Right.
you know, just saying that this is real, like there are other parts, you know, the virus is real, but so is um, the very real consequences of not seeing or touching or riding on the subway or,
Hmm. Yeah, that's so
yeah.
true. And like you mentioned, like yeah, like how so much of this is ultimately embodied, and that really speaks to I think a lot of what's happening right now, and a lot of I think like you mentioned the unanticipated kind of consequences of putting everyone in quarantine, because the story about like hugging being that thing that people miss, it's I a couple of weeks ago, or it's going to be released next week, but I actually had a discussion with Sarah Willen with the
Oh,
Pandemic
okay.
Journaling Project, and
Okay.
it was really cool to think about like what that would look like, and just hearing from you exactly what people are sharing about like what it is that's impacting them the most. It's like, yeah, health isn't something that's either just in your body or in your head. It's both. But I think one of the interesting things is touching on like, you know, mentioning about what New York, how the social connectivity seems to, at least stereotypically and maybe even in actuality seem a little bit stronger than it is in places that are just so expansive like LA. And I think like that has to impact like what health looks like in a place like that, and in every place. Like it just is different because there's all of these things that make it different. And the culture, just at least that subset of it, seemed to have shifted in a heartbeat. Now people, if you hug someone or get too close, I think that was one of the biggest things that really impacted me, was like going into Aldi and going into like, you know, going down the, you know, the aisles and just feeling how people were just really like not wanting each other to get close to each other. That's been such a shift, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've noticed too on the sidewalks of, people would greet each other,
Uh,
and now you sort of like 6 feet apart and you don't say
yeah.
hi. And it's so nice now that more and more people are actually sort of willing to have a conversation and craving
Mm,
that conversation, but not even
yeah.
like greeting each other, and how, this,
No.
I don't know, the element of suspicion, I suppose,
Yeah.
or that,
Or like just feeling like if you talk at someone, you're throwing the virus in the air at them, and so maybe that's like another way of feeling like you're hostile. I don't know.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, you mentioned LA, in relation to New York and how it's such a unique
Hmm.
place. And um, I have my most recent research and I'm sort of like rewriting the last chapters of my second book. But I work with Belizean garifuna communities in
Mm,
Belize, and Belizean Maya communities too. But like in also in New York and in LA,
yeah.
and oftentimes these are members of the same family. That some members are living in LA and some in New York. Um,
Mm,
but I feel like the way they sort of embody practice, there's a lot of overlap, but in some ways it's very, very different, right? Just because of the physical nature,
mm,
but also because of the different sorts of communities, I guess, that live in the different places. Like obviously there's big immigrant communities in both cities, and
mm.
but in New York, I feel like there's um, I don't know, the cultural practice with the proximity is sort of much more palpable, and there's like neighborhoods where people have lived for a very long time that are very specific to different, to Belizean Garifuna folks, or,
Mhm.
different a lot of Caribbean populations. And so I think that has a lot to do with difference, in addition to the, obviously the folks in cars and the
Right.
space, the
Yeah.
spatial divides. Um, yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking
Yeah.
about that a little bit because of, and it's interesting that you mention the uniqueness
Mm,
of New York. I'm really kind of trying to get at that. Like
yeah.
it's it's very unique in terms of, and also in terms of like, the spaces that people live in. And if everybody's home, well, in some communities where there's, where everybody has a bedroom, but that's not the
Mm,
norm, for young people. If you're a
right.
young person still living at home, that you would have your own bedroom is it's very uncommon um,
Right.
in the city. So like that, even that kind of spatial piece, I've been
Yeah.
thinking a lot about.
So in one of your recent articles, you talked about embodied ecological heritage, and you talked about it in the context of like Belize, and I wonder like what, I guess if you could define what that it means, but also like I wonder like how it would look if you did apply it to exactly what you're talking about, like Belizeans in New York, and comparison with Belizeans in LA, in comparison with still Belizeans in Belize. Like it, like I guess what are your thoughts on that? And yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, embodied ecological heritage. That's the framework, right?
Right.
And actually, and I know you have a strong interest in embodiment, and
Hmm.
um, but I came up with that, doing my dissertation research in Belize in a Maya community. And then when I moved to New York, I was thinking about how does that play out when people move, right? When people going through changes if, if you're in a rural, Maya community, and your traditions are important, and you continue to practice your traditional practices, and you relate those to your health. So that's what embodied ecological heritage is. It's the how our traditional practices relate to our health. So
Right.
I look at embodied practice and what people do, and how they connect those practices, those traditional practices or heritage practices. I use the word heritage, even though it's a more loaded term.
Right.
But as anthropologists, we critique all the terms, right? Traditional and
Yeah.
but I use heritage kind of purposefully, just because it's fluid and changes through practice how people define their heritage. And so I think about that as it relates to, is it a protective? Could embodied ecological heritage conceptualizing health as sort of through traditional practices? Is it protective, in immigrant communities who move to New York or to Los Angeles, or even in communities that move elsewhere in Belize? So there's, from the village that I worked in southern Belize, there's my community members that have moved to an island off the coast of Belize. That's primarily a vacation spot, and how they enact their traditions there, in
Right.
working in restaurants and resorts and whatnot. So um, I guess I started to think about whether it would be protective, right? So we think a lot about the negative implications for immigrant health, have been well documented, right? When people move and then they start to, their health starts to decline, maybe not initially, right? Um, and if how that intersects with them practicing traditions, and how their body changes through practicing these traditions. And I think that heritage is very closely linked to identity, right? And so how identity is defined. And like I was saying a little bit earlier, I'm finding, and I'm still working with the communities. This is sort of an ongoing project, but thinking about embodied ecological heritage in New York, I find that it's very easy to celebrate and to practice different sorts of traditions, right? Your identity to be Caribbean, your identity to be Belizean, your identity to be Garifuna. And I'm starting to find in LA that there's very strong Belizean Garifuna communities, but there's a narrative that young people are less linked to that sort of an identity, that they identify as Caribbean or they identify as Belizean or Garifuna, right?
Right.
And there's more of you know, there's more of a sort of a like a Black American identity that maybe is embraced.
Right.
And I'm thinking about the reasons for that, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with what you were saying, are, these opportunities to actually come together and inhabit a space and you know um, embody these traditional practices. And obviously that's much more complex than that. And issues of identity in New York, like I was saying, there's many different people from many different various Caribbean communities, and there are in cities across the United States, of course. But in New York, this idea of like, we came here to New York, and like we have these very distinct identities, and they're very critical. They're
Right.
critical to health. People say that, it's not just me sort of teasing out those connections as far as with my research, but people, it's very easy to understand how critical they are to health. And maybe it's because there's many people, I mean, I work obviously with my students, but many people know, you know, they have a grandparent or a great grandparent that was from a place where they had a farm or somewhere that they could enact their traditions in ways that we might think about as, or there might be as tied into identity. So whether that's, preparation of and harvesting and, those kinds of those practices are, I think, it's not unusual to know about those practices. And I don't know that it's unusual in Los Angeles in many communities, but it may be more unusual, right? And more unusual to be in a space where that can be the conversation.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What are some practices that you're referring to? Because I yeah, I don't, I guess like I'd wager a lot of people don't really know about like um garifuna and some of like the ethnic Caribbean groups like in Belize. Like I don't know if you could sort of go into like what some of those practices look like.
Sure. Sure. Well, when I was first sort of thinking about embodied ecological heritage, sort of developing the framework, I was living in a Maya community, and there's a lot of traditional practice around the planting and harvesting and preparation of corn, right? So these are sort of agricultural practices, but they're more than agricultural practices, of course, because they frame daily life and daily practice, and they kind of frame sort of sensory experience, to get back to sort of what we think about when we're talking about someone's lived experience and their sensory experience of a moment. So those practices in Belize, in the Maya community, were around sort of like the burning of incense, the planting of corn, through reciprocal labor practices, right? This idea of the sociality and the way of organizing labor being sort of human reciprocity,
Right.
and what's expected in and to be part, to think about yourself as a Maya person, that ties into identity, like what Maya people do. And so you burn incense, you follow a certain pattern where you kill an animal. That animal, feeds the community that's coming together to plant. And so those practices are tied in, the smell, what you're doing, the what you see, what you hear, all of that is tied into what makes a well person, and is fundamental to identity, right? Heritage identity. So in southern Belize too, and throughout the coastal areas of Belize, there is also a garifuna community that, and similarly, there's this connection to the land and land practices, and also a strong connection to fishing, right? Traditionally, coastal folks, and strong connecting to fishing. So those are the kinds of practices, I guess, that sort of have framed this traditional identity. And obviously, fishing looks very different in New York and Los Angeles, but it comes to thinking about what the fundamental identity, or the fundamental, what are these fundamental heritage practices. And even though kids in LA and New York may not be fishing, or they may be, there are places to do that, but they may not be fishing in the same way, right? They may be learning songs that talk about fishing, or that tell stories in the Garifuna language. So I would say in Garifuna communities, language is very important, and maintaining Garifuna language. And that's something that I see in New York and Los Angeles, that the language is used in often in church and mass, but also in working with young people and learning songs and music. And so let's say, even if you don't go fishing, if you're using the same words, right, using the same language, and thinking and singing about going fishing, that's something that people talk about as very important to Garifuna tradition, right?
Right.
Food obviously is another one as well, and food as medicine, among all these indigenous communities in Belize, that the two that I've worked with, I would say that food is something that's easily exported, and I'm sure you've experienced that.
Yeah.
everywhere you've lived, right? People like to eat traditional foods, but the
Yeah,
connection
definitely.
between those and the actual sort of the time and the sociality that's associated with preparation is
Hmm.
something that's pretty critical, right? So in a very so embodied ecological heritage goes beyond just saying that, there's the social piece, right, where people come
Hmm.
together and they make food together, and that's important for keeping them healthy. We all know that we're social animals and we need that for health, but it goes into sort of the sensory experience of doing that in
Mm.
community, and the smells, and where those smells, how they kind of interact with um with our body as part of the sensory experience, the embodied experience of
Mm.
being alive and being well.
Yeah, that
So
sounds really cool. Just because it sounds like it's sort of drawing in every sort of aspect of human life in order to further contextualize health. Because you talked about like language in terms of fishing and these things being important uh, for garifuna communities, and even after migration, it's still something that's retained in a lot of ways, and that's powerful in that like it's like there is this by definition a transition occurring when people migrate, but at the same time we're not blank slates. Like we bring a lot with us, and it feels like embodied ecological heritage really touches on each of those things, like the heritage piece really being embodied, but ultimately the ecology that we're often in or even transitioning to also ultimately influences what it ends up looking like. And yeah, I think that could speak to why like migrant health or immigrant health um, really looks the way it does. And that's a whole other issue in like medical anthropology. Yeah.
definitely, yeah. I think that um, there's a lot in there, right?
Hmm.
I think it's easy to sort of give a nod to a piece of that,
Right.
but I think that thinking about migrant health, if we could push it even further into
Hmm.
this into the embodied realm, not just
Mm.
sort of access, which is incredibly important when we talk about health and migrant health and anthropology, but to kind of think about it from this embodied perspective, and
Right.
and how people talk about it. There's
Mm.
um I,
Yeah, that I really like that because it's I feel like I sort of love sort of biocultural like
mhm.
frameworks, and um it's it reminds me of, I think Sarah Horton talked about like biocultural transitions from uh like her in her case study, like rural parts of Mexico to rural or even urban parts of Mexico to the US, and like what it looks like in those transitions. And it's like drawing in a framework that pulls in everything. I feel like that's it's a lot of what makes like anthropology what it is. um and a big part of getting at that is like ethnography. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about cool anthropology. I know that's a huge project that you have right now.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And ethnography is a big part of that. And I
Right.
would say that so Cool Anthropology is a collective that I co-founded with Victoria Costa. Um, and we're dedicated basically to getting anthropology out of the ivory tower, and the
Mm.
benefits of this anthropological perspective that you highlighted, this sort of broad, holistic, deep, thick
Hmm.
perspective, and making it sort of relevant for everyday folks. And I think as anthropologists, we're very good at capturing that, but not always so good at sharing it in a way that um, is useful, right? Is
Mm.
And it makes sense
Mm.
to others. And so we're dedicated to that. And we have a website and lots of different projects. And basically, we started with embodied ecological heritage. Actually, the framework that I came up with, with the dissertation that we've been talking about, and we started to do installations. So where people came and engaged with sort of a multimedia experience. So the Embodied Ecological Heritage installation invited artists and community members to come together with academics and talk about how they conceptualized embodied ecological heritage in their work.
Mm.
And people came into a room and they were invited to grind corn, and they were invited to
Mm.
watch video and to view art and to be part of the art and sort corn seed. And so it became, the idea is that we believe that if you have an embodied experience, you're much more likely to go and talk about it.
Right.
That said, it exists. These installations exist in digital spaces as well. The latest one that's showing up on our social media is related to an installation called Ethnography Matters that began in 2017. So you mentioned
Mm.
ethnography, and that was sort of inspired. We were inspired by the fake news discussion, right? Sort of what
Mm.
was happening in the journalistic media, and thought about what ethnographers or anthropologists could bring to the table in terms of really understanding in depth what someone with an opposing opinion or might be, really kind of getting at that deep empathy, what they might be thinking and feeling, and explaining it in the way that
Mm.
ethnography allows us to kind of capture. And
Yeah.
so that's a project that's ongoing. We invite participation through our social media, through kind of highlighting different ethnographers and their contribution. Um, and we also started a project in 2015, the Shifting Stereotypes project, which is still ongoing as well, where we think about stereotyping language in the context of people in power, and we asked people to
Mm.
actually read quotes, so to sort of embody the sort of stereotyping, hateful language, and see how they
Yeah.
felt. And we interviewed them on how they felt actually saying those words, thinking
Mm.
about how to, you know these issues of that, or how to, if you're complicit, maybe saying the words out loud rather than not just saying, oh yeah, that's not good, but actually needing to
Right.
kind of embody that. So that is
Mm.
moving to its own. That'll be released shortly. The full
Yeah.
interactive documentary. That's been a very a process, through 2015, 16. It was
Yeah.
based around, back then, around the Black Lives Matter movement, the Not One More movement, and the Change the Name movement. Those sort of public movements sort of framed the project, and now we're offering sort of a curriculum to go along with this more public interactive documentary. So
Mm.
yeah, that work, we're expansive. We want to include, we've had a lot of collaborators, some of which have been on your show.
Mm-hmm.
Heidi Castaneda, collaborated with us in shifting stereotypes. So yeah, so that's a little bit about co-anthropology. You can
Yeah.
follow us
It's
on social media, but we do very our mission is to really kind of represent what anthropology and ethnography can bring to the table, and have very credible research, but in a way that's available for popular consumption. So, and we like to step out of, like, we want to engage with the current moment, but we don't involve ourselves in sort of, you know, political debates. I think
mm.
anthropology is inherently an activist in the way I think about practicing. It's inherently political and activist, but we sort of
Right.
engage through the research, which we think
Yeah.
is valuable. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe some
I
people
think
think it's valuable.
yeah, because everything that you said in terms of your projects, like I guess the word that came up in my head was like it feels very confrontational, but in a way that feels not like I'm saying it probably, but like in terms of ethnography, something that you've mentioned and touched on is how um in some of your writings as well as here, like in terms of what ethnography is and how it's different from more, I guess, like positivist or what we typically associate with like science oriented types of stuff. And the thing is, like, ethnography, it's a lot about capturing like subjective experience. And the thing is, that's not alien. Like, ultimately, even our medical systems capture subjective pain and subjective experience in terms of what people are experiencing in relationship to maybe a health condition or maybe something else. But there's something that we know is powerful about subjective experience. And I've looking through the Ethnography Matters website, like, you have all these questions that ethnographers, like for ethnographers or for people to consider in relationship to ethnography in terms of methodology and all these things. And the thing is, thinking about it, it's interesting to see how really touching on like ethnography as a methodology ultimately touches on like that more humanistic aspect of science, of people's experiences. And I think that's what I mean by like confrontational. Like, it's coming into what people are experiencing, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and sort of even looking back on what some of your students said in terms of like the power of a hug and the whole embodiment aspect that you're touching on, and how stress is embodied. The relief of stress through a hug is also embodied. Like, there are no sort of lines between any of these things. And yeah, I think the Ethnography Matters, I guess it sort of touches on just that, on what ethnography is. Because I think in terms of the social sciences, even, a lot of people are still kind of like, ethnography is still really alien to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a culture, I enjoyed statistics, and I have papers with numbers in them, but I think as a culture, there's something, we feel like there's something more real, right, about
Right.
statistics or numbers in that way. And from a public health perspective, when we're thinking about population health, or we're making these kind of generalizations, we feel like that's the way we need to go. And I think the whole point with the Ethnography Matters project is that these data are actually richer. They're actually they're more empirical in a sense, right? Like, they're actually
Mm-hmm.
more real. When you talk about the embodiment of a hug, it's it's interesting that we've come to a point where somehow we think like the abstraction of the human, and sort of like this generalization or this numerical kind of is somehow more real to many
Yeah.
people. I don't want to be reductive, because I know there's many people who think about this in a nuanced way, and like I said, I appreciate numbers, but I think that the idea behind the project is to recognize that the data collected with ethnography, if we want to use a sciencey word, is more, it should be trusted, and that
Right.
ethnographers are trained and should be trusted individuals. Like, we should trust our bodies, right? I was taught that like way at the beginning, and I feel like sometimes
Mm.
we lose sight of that
Right.
that there is trust in the way that, you know, a human connecting with another human, but trust in the way that we collect information with our bodies,
Right.
um, and how we process that information. So it's capturing the
Mm.
subjective experience, but almost sort of trusting the ethnographer and the subjectivity that comes with that ethnographic experience as actually being more objective in the world. Like, that's actually what gets more objective than,
Mm.
what is actually embodied in practice. So it's sort of
Yeah.
turning it on
Yeah.
its head a little bit. I mean, these aren't new concepts, but I think they're ones that we need to remind.
Mm-hmm.
And like other social sciences, like you said, or even sometimes we need to remind ourselves. I think, and
Mm-hmm.
as anthropologists, I think that the rest of the public too sometimes, I'm sure you get this, we all get this, that they think about the anthropologist as someone who's hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Right.
and there is
Yeah.
hanging out, but like putting that sort of empirical truth into the hanging out is, I think,
Yeah.
is important to remind ourselves, and to allow ourselves that space too. Like when we started the conversation, we were talking about the hug and my student that needed permission, and just creating a space where my students have permission to know that the way that they're feeling about
Mm.
their, their social disconnection and, their stress is actually, it's empirical, it's real, it's science too, And I think that by being, that can help. I think being less reductive can help us all in all walks of our life, right? I think
Yeah.
anthropology is so good at that, and that we could help change conversations. That's something that Victoria and I in co-anthropology talk about all the time, is changing conversations. How do you change conversation and then you change culture, right? So,
Mhm.
um, and you change conversations because people feel a way.
Right.
That's how we work. Not to
Yeah.
generalize about all humans, but and it's so interesting that we talk about, we sort of get more disconnected, when we're talking about public discourse, and we rely on things that seem very sort of very disconnected from the actual human experience, even though we're talking about human experience and human lives and policies that guide
Mm.
human experience too. So it's interesting, something that I think about that's worth mentioning. And we're lifting up ethnography, and I mentioned my public health students in the School of Public Health, the graduate school, they think a lot about, I think people sometimes see the value of ethnography and they think a lot about budgets and time, right?
Mm.
And
Mhm.
even in academia, right? We think about, okay, we have to accomplish this, our grant runs out.
Mm.
And ethnography takes time. If you're
Time is
going to
money.
really
You're right.
know something, you need to take the time to know it. So if you're
Exactly.
going to know
Yeah.
it, and
Mm.
but then it's so much more valuable, like the way we weigh, oh, it's going to take too much time. And it's like, well, then we're going to have a policy or a service or resources that are generated based on data that are incomplete at best, right?
Mhm.
Incomplete. So,
Right.
um, anyway.
Yeah. I think um that the thing that you said right now that's stuck in my mind so powerfully is how like the abstraction of numbers becomes more powerful than like the human experiences, which are the complete data. And I think the reason that why that sticks is because yeah, I think that's something powerful. Like people, like numbers don't lie, right? Like there's a lot of like tropes that we have about like the power of numbers, and a lot of the times just showing people the numbers can change minds. There's a power to it that some of it's deserving, but also at the same time, numbers are abstracted and by definition not really, they can't ever really tell you why something's happening. And it it's interesting because I know that in qualitative research generally, including in ethnography, there's an inclination to want to sort of quantify things sometimes, like, well, if everyone said this one thing, then that means it must be more true. Or if someone said this and then someone said this, how can like it's almost like this inclination to want to say, like, again, pit numbers against each other. And something that you've sort of mentioned in a lot of your writings is how ethnography is like rich. You also pull from like phenomenology and that human subjective experience. And I think that's such a core of it that I think is something that I guess social scientists need to also like understand as well, in terms of like each one has its place. Like the numbers do have their place, kind of like you mentioned. Like there's so much and power in that. There's also ways that statistics can sort of put you on the path towards investigating something a little bit deeper, just like ethnography can. And yeah, it's just really complementary, I think, and not at all at odds with each other.
No, I
Yeah.
agree. I think that the many different ways that we can say things, and we can, get our message out, or our data or our research or the benefits of the work that we do. You can speak to many different audiences, and sometimes the numbers will kind of get you into a room or into a conversation where you can bring the ethnography in, and that's very
Mm.
effective. and a game changer, and vice versa. I think that telling a story, and a very, powerful story, and, can widen the conversation to what's
Right.
happening in communities more broadly. So, and open and contextualize statistics in ways that sometimes I feel like, aren't always contextualized in popular media. So,
Yeah.
or very often aren't. Maybe I'll even, not that I want to be too controversial, but
Yeah.
it is very difficult for a layperson, a person just, reading the news like myself, or to tease out, the
Right.
levels of analysis
Yeah.
and go beyond a headline. That's something that ethnography does, right? You certainly go beyond a headline.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
And um I guess something that stuck out in my head as well from one of your recent pieces on like theory and embodied ecological knowledge, heritage is um like, and also in terms of your discussions on health and how we dichotomize health, like body mind kind of stuff, mental health, physical health, and um like there was a mention of like we tend to dichotomize things, and anthropology attempts to sort of put them together and really see the lines between them that run across them. And at the same time, you mentioned how there's like a power in kind of these dichotomies. And I think the reason why that sticks out is because I think there's something about models that we like. They make things maybe a little bit easier to think through by sort of separating them. And I guess when we think about theory and method, it's like, I guess the question I ask myself is like, how seriously are we taking those models? Like, are we going to really like sort of leave the dichotomy the way it is, or are we going to actually like, work around and play with it? Kind of like you mentioned in terms of like how you see theory as something to sort of be played with a little bit. And I think like that freedom to want to play with it and not sort of stick with the model, I think that's one of the more powerful things that I think I've taken away from like this conversation with you. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to take away, and I hope that I think you said earlier that like I touch on all these different aspects of theory and kind of try to bring them together, and I think that I said something once in a talk almost 10 years ago, that cognitive phenomenology is not an oxymoron, and everybody was like, "Wait, what do you mean?" Because there was always this division between sort of the more bio medical anthropology and the more social, the bio side and the social side. They actually called it that, I
Right.
think, which is a very traditional way to kind of divide up programming.
Mhm.
So we even do it to ourselves, right? We're trying to like interrogate dichotomies theoretically, but
Mhm.
are you more bio or are you more social?
Yeah.
And so I sort of use this sort of cognitive piece and this phenomenological piece, which have been sort of pitted against each other in various kinds of ways throughout theoretical history. Yeah, so I'm happy that you took that, and I think that I'm going to think about it more playfully based on this conversation, because I think about, I know I had mentioned, playing around with theory, but I think that it kind of takes you to a place, if you think about why, it's easy to divide things up, right? Like we're taught to do
Mhm.
that in preschool. I'm always telling people, especially when we're talking about, stereotyping and, categories, and we're taught to like that, right? Put all the orange ones here and sort out the red ones, and the blocks go over there.
Right.
And it makes us feel good in a sense, right? Like you said, there's like something that we like about the models, but how far are we
Mhm.
going to push that in interrogating them? And do we always interrogate them in the same way? Sometimes I think that there's a power in kind of thinking through how they've been interrogating them and kind of them bringing them back in. I think I sort of did that with this word heritage. You had Antoinette Jackson on, and
Mhm.
she was the first person that encouraged me to think about heritage, the way I think about heritage. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to mention that because I think it's like, it's a good example of what you're talking about. It's like, are we defining things in these very kinds of extreme dichotomous ways, right? So like, our heritage is good, our heritage is bad, our heritage means, doing this one thing, anybody who
Mm-hmm.
has this identity must do this one thing. Oh, that's not really
Mm-hmm.
heritage. That was something that, we started doing very recently in our community, and we can't call that heritage. And it's like, well, why not?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that that's a good question for us all to ask ourselves. I'm going to ask myself. I'm going to encourage myself to play with the dichotomies even more than I do. And I think that we need to own them, right? Like, we need to own that it's part of our discipline, but also part of like the worldview. And if we're
Mm-hmm.
going to kind of encourage people beyond just anthropologists playing with theory, if we're going to kind of encourage people to push it even further, we need to go beyond the usual critiques. And maybe part of going beyond the usual critiques is kind of seeing the value and then breaking it down. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that sounds good. That sounds really important. Yeah. Like moving
I
beyond
don't know.
critique. Yeah.
I think there's something important in there for sure. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's but I do think like there, we're all thinking about health right now, right? So this work that you're doing with the podcast and us as medical anthropologists, I think that we have a real opportunity and a duty, really, to kind of think about how we've been theorizing health and how we've been kind of deploying that into health spaces, and being comfortable. I feel like that we sort of need to own our strengths. I think that's something that, yeah, if we're saying, okay, it's not so clear, and we're playing around with these dichotomies, and we're thinking about, these theoretical divides, and the culture and the way the culture thinks about health, and ethnography, and how that's, how we're collecting data. I think that it's good for us to highlight those strengths and not try to engage in some, I don't know, some other sort of way. And we have an obligation to do that, to sort of highlight the strengths of what makes our work so valuable. This being able to capture a lived experience. There's a lot of nuance, I think, that will need to be captured, that should be, that we should be working to capture in the current moment. Not that there hasn't been, but there's like this imperative for the capturing of nuance that we can offer the collective, our collective consciousness right now, the pandemic consciousness. I don't know what we want to call it. The change moment, and I do think that it's not trying to engage in the same way as so many other folks are. I think it's kind of heading back to our roots in method and theory, if that makes sense in the context of this conversation.
Yeah, I think it does, because I mean, in so many ways, it's a whole new world now, and yeah, it makes sense why we'd be sort of falling back on the fundamentals in order to kind of deal with moving forward, and sort of, it's almost like looking back and sort of, now how are we going to apply that to this new moment? And I guess that's a question for you. Like what do you have coming up in terms of sort of what the future looks like for you, in terms of like your professional career or anything?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. I mean, I have to say that I feel very privileged to be teaching introductory urban community health right now, and infusing this anthropological perspective, and just sort of, supporting my students in that way. I'm working on my second book. It's part of the University of Arizona Press's Global Health, Global Change series.
Mm.
And I was in a good place with that. And then this happened. And I was talking with the Global Health, Global Change. So I'm going to
Yeah.
do a little revising of the closing chapters. But that book looks at what we were talking about earlier, how embodied ecological heritage is sort of deployed through change. So spatial
Mm-hmm.
change, that's working with garifuna, Belizean garifuna communities in New York and Los Angeles, but also sort of, and working with, Belizean Maya communities moving out of villages and into those more communities that they did not grow in, and thinking about how heritage practice moves with us and how that affects health. So
Mm.
I'm updating that, I guess, or kind of incorporating um,
Mm.
how does embodied ecological heritage help us think about this moment? What are folks in New York and Los
Mm.
Angeles and in Belize, everybody's experiencing sort of a common kind of isolation.
Mm.
Obviously that's experienced in different ways, and where does heritage, how does that intersect? So I'm working on finishing that up. That will hopefully be out next year, I would say, with
Mm.
the University of Arizona Press. And that's a great series by Sissy Fowler and Liz Olson. They're putting that series together, and I'm sure if anybody has stories from they this is a great series to be doing now, so I'm sure they would
Mm.
be interested in others joining that series. We also have a edited volume coming out with Cool Anthropology, where we have worked with many different cool anthropologists who are
Mm.
getting their anthropology out of the ivory tower into the public space in different kinds of ways. So we have a lot of great collaborators. Scott Wilson is doing some great VR work at Cal
Mm.
State Long Beach, and he's got a chapter, and Augustin Fuentes, who is working, a biological anthropology apologist, working at the issues of race and gender, and which are also very important right now. A lot of collaborators that have been with us for a long time, Carrie Hawk-Lassard, different folks that are part of that volume.
Mm.
So that's going to be coming out, and I think that our hope is to kind of push, what anthropology can offer the moment a little further. And
Mhm.
we have a Wenner Gren funded workshop that's going to happen with Cool Anthropology in February, and we're
Nice.
going to have people voting on what the most important questions are. We would discuss and vote on what questions should anthropology be answering right now.
Mm.
Some of those I think have come up in your
Yeah.
work and your podcast and beyond, but what can we offer, and what's the most important thing for us to be offering right now in anthropology? So we're looking forward to that workshop. We've got a
Mm.
workshop with the New York Academy of Sciences coming up, the anthropology division, in September, on how you can leverage social media to get your ethnography out there.
Right.
Let's see. I feel like there's other things, but maybe that's enough for now.
That's
I
so
don't know.
much. Yeah, you're really busy. It sounds like you have a lot going on. That's really cool. A lot of like
Yeah.
looking at anthropology moving forward stuff.
Yeah. I think that sometimes I get teased, I work in a very interdisciplinary enviirment at CUNY, and
Mhm.
sometimes I get teased. They're like, "Oh, are you an anthropologist?" Because I very much sort of, because I teach sort of seminar classes that are sort of around broad social topics and things. So I'm not always teaching anthropology, but per se. But I think that we should sort of, lean into our anthropology. I guess I've said that already, but um,
Mhm.
so thinking about that, you sort of more broadly. This is my tenure year, so I mean, I
Mm.
think if we think traditionally that maybe can think even more expansively about what scholarship looks like in
Hmm.
anthropology as well, and throughout the university. I would love to see this public work and these contributions sort of be valued by our peers more as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so I think that there's a lot on the horizon. Thank you for giving me an
Yeah.
opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about it. And I love that you're doing this podcast now. I think that this is a really great time to be engaging with
Mhm.
sort of anthropology and medical anthropology from this perspective. It's a perspective that's um, perhaps underrepresented. And I think that
Yeah.
that's really critical
Yeah, it
to
is. Thank you
represent it.
so much for being on. I really appreciate getting to talk about your work, about your theory, and yeah, your sort of public projects with Cool Anthropology. I think that it is really cool to sort of see what you're doing with anthropology and how you're sort of putting it out in the public sphere. And it seems so collaborative in a way that I think anthropology needs to be going forward. So I really appreciated having you on.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.